Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the show that is oozing with content. Is that really where we're at now? Is that how I want to start this video? Hello and welcome to Monster of the Week, the show where we dig up old creatures from past editions of D&D and convert them into 5th edition so you can use them in your current 5e campaign. My name is Josiah, known here as a Dungeon Dad, and today we're looking at a creature that originally entered the game in AD&D. The Ghaunadan was originally introduced as an ooze, but not just a regular ooze. It was meant to be an intelligent ooze. So you have your gelatinous cubes and your ochre jellies and your black puddings, whatever, all doing their oozy slime thing, breaking down flesh, turning people into skeletons that float around in them all mysterious-like. But the Ghaunadan was meant to be a little bit different. These creatures are intelligent, more intelligent even than your average person. And they aren't just smart slimes, they're smart slimes that can also transform their bodies to take on the appearance of a humanoid. So imagine your gelatinous acidic cube of jello, but it can also turn into a guy. That's pretty much what a Ghaunadan is at its core and most broken down form. But there's a lot to unpack here in terms of how their society functions, where they even came from in the first place, and there's a million different ways that you can use these guys in your actual game, whether as a major plot hook or just as kind of a one-off encounter for your party to run into. All of which are super fun and interesting, and I'm really excited to talk about these guys. And as always, if you think this monster sounds really cool and you want to try using it in your D&D campaign, well, there is a stat block in the description below which you can click on to check this guy out, which I have personally converted from AD&D and also 3.5 in this case, into 5th edition. So today we're going to talk about how this creature fights and from a mechanical perspective how you can use it to create some fun encounters, and then we're going to talk about plot hooks and storytelling and ways that you can incorporate it into your game that way. So before I get too ahead of myself here though, why don't you take a seat, grab a bowl of jello, give it a poke, make sure it's not sentient, and settle in for a moment while we talk about... If you're following along with the stat block, as I know some of you guys do when I talk about my monsters, something that you will notice immediately, which should catch you by surprise, is that this creature has a very high charisma score. I don't want to paint all oozes with a broad brush here, but they're not exactly known for being the most charismatic folks. The Ghaunadan, however, is of course the exception to that. They are not only intelligent oozes, but they're also very good at articulating themselves and are quite charismatic. The book goes as far to say that their humanoid forms are actually quite beautiful in a certain way. And that description isn't just fluff, it actually informs one of their most notorious abilities, which is that of the friendly gaze, which basically means anytime a creature looks directly into this thing's eyes, it can effectively enchant them or charm them with an effect equivalent to a friend's spell. In my conversion of the document, I've kind of tuned it up a little bit to make it matter a little bit more in combat. For example, if it does manage to charm someone, they're going to have disadvantage on attack rolls against it. But effectively, it can do that whole like vampire thing, look into my eyes, we're cool now, but it's a slime. So that is very interesting. And then when you couple that with the fact that it can change shape between literally a slime and a humanoid creature that is made up of said slime, you kind of start to get a picture of how these creatures operate. Their ability to kind of sneak into areas potentially undetected is unprecedented. Because of course, as an ooze, it is amorphous and has that immutable form trait, which means that it can't have its physicality purposefully shifted by any type of magic. And it also means that it can, squeeze between cracks in walls or a crack under the door, very tight spaces, as narrow as an inch wide to get specific, without having to squeeze or really cause any harm to itself. A creature like that could pretty easily slip into any place that it wants to be, and if it runs into any resistance, maybe it can enchant the guards or whoever seems to spot it and, make them forget what they saw, send them on their way, and call it a day. However, when it comes to actually fighting in a brawl, the Ghaunadan is no slouch. It has a few options at its disposal. For starters, the way that this thing sees is with blind sight. It has blind sight out to 60 feet, which is both kind of a blessing and a curse. In specific situations, that can actually work against this creature because it can only see out to 60 feet and is effectively blind beyond that. But what that does mean is that you effectively have this sphere within 60 feet in every direction that the Ghaunadan knows exactly what's going on. Its entire body functions as a sensory organ. So this thing is going to be almost impossible to sneak up on. It also means that some tricks that your party might employ, such as blinding the creature with magic or even something physical like a flash bomb, it's not going to work. It also means the creature can't be deafened because it doesn't rely on sound to hear, so to speak. So this method of experiencing the world through blind sight is something that can destroy a party who's not prepared for it or who tries a few tricks that normally work on other things, not realizing that it's not going to work on this creature. But if the party knows about this, it can also be exploited as a weakness. And in terms of actually dealing damage, it has that beloved pseudopod attack, which almost every slime creature has. Whether it's in its ooze form or its humanoid form, a giant lash of this slime can kind of come out of its body from anywhere, really, smack a creature for some bludgeoning damage, and of course, because it is an acidic slime, it can cause that creature to become paralyzed potentially. So that's a pretty neat trick. But one thing that we need to keep in mind here is that this creature has a humanoid form. It can use weapons. It can wear armor. By default in the stat block, I've included a longsword attack because that's just kind of our go-to middle-of-the-road solid melee weapon. And if you're just running this thing for a quick combat, like a longsword, that's going to take you pretty far. Of course, it can't use these weapons when it's in its pseudopod form. I imagine the longsword just kind of floating around in its body, and then it transitions into its humanoid form, sword at the ready. But if you think that this monster's armor class might be a little bit low for an encounter you're planning, it can have a suit of plate mail floating around inside of it. You know, you want it to do more damage, give it a greatsword. You want to mix things up a little bit, give it 2 short swords. You can even give it ranged weapons. Anything that a humanoid creature can do, this creature can also do. That's something very important to keep in mind when you're looking at the stat block of not just this, but any humanoid creature. That's always like the baseline normal average guy on the side of the road that you just bump into version of that creature, right? So you can add anything that any human or elf or dwarf would be able to do on top of this creature if you feel like it. I mean, if you wanted to have one of these guys who was a mage of some kind or a cleric or something, you could even assign them spells, give them a staff. The options really are unlimited in terms of what you can do with a humanoid type monster. Just keep in mind you'll have to explain those things are floating around inside of its body when it's in the ooze form. And depending on what it has equipped with it, it might make it a little bit more difficult to slide and slink into certain places. Sneaking between a crack in a wall with a longsword is one thing. Sneaking in with a giant maul and a full set of plate armor is a little bit more challenging. So it has a few different options at its disposal, but one of the most fun things that this creature can do, which I think is really cool, is something that I have called the disarming strike. See, as an ooze that's able to change its body composition in seconds, something it can do that might catch some of your players off guard is steal their weapons. It can adjust the hardness of its body in a microsecond, meaning that if your fighter comes up and skewers this thing with their sword, it can then harden its body around the sword wound, so that when your fighter goes to pull back, suddenly that sword doesn't come out. Mechanically, the way this works is the attacking creature has to make an athletics check, and if they roll under a 17, their weapon is now stuck inside the Ghaunadan's body. If they roll over a 17, then they manage to strong arm it back out and pull it despite the Ghaunadan's attempt to keep it inside of itself. This is a really neat ability because it will catch melee characters off guard, and it kind of creates an oh shit moment, like what else do I have that I can fight this thing with? And then suddenly your fighter, who's been relying on their greatsword for the entire campaign, is looking for daggers or short swords or whatever random weapons they happen to have in their pack while the campaign was going on and they were just collecting stuff. And if they don't have any of that stuff, I guess we're fist fighting now. A side note on that, if a creature makes an unarmed strike against the ooze and fails that athletics check, then the creature is grappled because the ooze literally pulls them and grabs onto their arm or their foot or whatever it is they're trying to strike the ooze with. So it can be just as dangerous. Something else I love about this ability, which should not be overlooked, is that the sword or mace or whatever the weapon is that gets stuck inside of the ooze doesn't just disappear. It's still lodged in their body, so that character can come and try to take it out or whatever and get their weapon back if they want to. But let's say you have someone with a really great magic weapon and they stab a Ghaunadan and it manages to wrest it out of their hands. The Ghaunadan is trained in martial weapons. Maybe it drops that crappy longsword it's been lugging around and says, hey, I have a +3 longsword now. This is awesome. You can literally turn the magic weapons your party is using against them if they're unable to make those saving throws. And that is not only kind of hilarious, but is a really fun and interesting way to mix up combat. And that pretty much sums up the gist of how you're going to want to run the Ghaunadan in combat. They can be stealthy when they need to. They can make a quick getaway and slide into a crack if they're outmatched. And they're going to try to take those weapons away while targeting the creatures who don't need weapons to fight. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm as down for an all-out brawl as the next DM, but the most interesting thing about these guys, I think, is the implications and plot hooks and how we can use them in our stories. So, without further ado, let's talk about some. So, what could have caused a puddle of slime to become intelligent? And what could have caused a puddle of slime to become intelligent and also gain this semi-chaotic ability to turn into a guy? The answer to that question lies with none other than Ghaunadan. Who's Ghaunadan, you may be asking? Well, Ghaunadan is, of course, an elder god. He is the god of slimes, of oozes, and... Wait, you're probably thinking of Dweeblex when I talk about the god of slimes and oozes. He's the demon lord of slimes and oozes. Ghaunadan is the god of slimes and oozes who is attached to Dweeblex in one way or another. It's a lot. All you really need to know about Ghaunadan is he was the patron deity of slimes and oozes and chaos and destruction, and he was very upset with Lolth one time, I think, and lashed out, and through this grand strike of his pseudopod, bestowed a bunch of slimes in the area with malice and sentience. Whether he did that on purpose or not, hard to say. There's a lot of really interesting lore around Ghaunadan, actually, because he kind of defies a lot of what we know to be true about deities in the canon Forgotten Realms D&D setting. But that's not what this video is about, so I'm not going to get way into that right now. However, I will link down below to a pretty cool lore video that you should check out if that sounds interesting to you. But in any case, that is the in-canon explanation for why the Ghaunadan became sentient in the first place. And in the Forgotten Realms, that is why the Ghaunadan are completely loyal to him. You know, they do whatever he wants whenever he wants them to do it, and most of the time that is nothing, but sometimes he calls them to action to go crusade against the humans or the elves or the dwarves or whatever. All of that stuff can be really interesting because it paints the Ghaunadan in a very fascinating light. They're able to put on these perfect humanoid guises so that they appear human or they appear dwarvish or they appear elvish, whatever the case may be. But just beneath the surface is truly what a Ghaunadan is, which is an ooze. A sentient one, a smart one, but ultimately still a predator. And all of this charm and this ability to kind of schmooze their way into society is a tool to them. It's like a switch, and they can turn it on and off in an instant. The second that someone reveals themselves as a threat to the Ghaunadan or whatever its goal happens to be at that time, they can lash out and completely destroy that creature, leaving nothing behind, bones and all. And that's scary. Not only is that scary, that's great potential for a villainous NPC. A Ghaunadan would make an excellent high-ranking member or even leader of a thieves guild or some type of shadow network beneath the city streets, able to blend in polite society but no one knows their true identity. Or you could even do a kind of a murder mystery Jack the Ripper, Hannibal Lecter style campaign with your party where the mass murderer they're chasing down actually happens to be a sentient slime person. And I mean, hey, as I say with literally every monster I've ever covered, that's the canon explanation. We can throw all of that in the bin if we want to. And in some cases, I suggest you do. Because there's a lot more that can be done with a Ghaunadan other than having them be this treacherous kind of beauty's only skin deep type villain. While that does make a really great villain, maybe in your world they just evolved naturally and weren't the result of some evil god lashing out and giving the ooze sentience. Perhaps they're not necessarily all evil in your world. Perhaps you have some of these guys that do indeed live in this kind of shadow network underneath the city streets or at the fringes of society where they won't be found, but they only do so because they know people would be terrified of them if they were to discover their true nature. The world might just not be ready for sentient slime people yet. I would even take it a step further and say that in the right campaign, if you want to put in a little bit of work as a DM, it could be a really cool player race. Obviously, when you're including weird player race options like this into your campaign, you have to do it with care and thought and consider your players at the table and whether they're going to be able to kind of take on some of the work of developing that, but it could be a really fun option. At the very least, you could include one of these guys as a cool NPC who's meant to interact with the party. And by virtue of the fact that the Ghaunadan can turn into any humanoid race, it can be anybody. It could be the party patron, it could be the party's villain, it could be a side character, it can be someone who's meant there to hinder them, it could be someone who's meant there to assist them, it could just be someone who's meant there to interact with at the bar. Whatever the case is, you can make anyone a Ghaunadan, and it's just kind of like a fun, interesting thing to throw into that character's backstory. And who knows how that could be relevant? Is that NPC connected to this shadow network of pseudopod men that live under the streets? Maybe that shadow network does exist and they've segregated themselves from it because they don't believe in the bad stuff that's going on with them. Or maybe they're just a one-off and their people live far away and they're completely detached from them and they're just keeping their identity secret because they don't know how everyone would feel about that here. There's a million different ways you could spin that, and all of them are pretty fun in my opinion. Something else worth mentioning here as well is that when a Ghaunadan turns into its humanoid form, it's not like a doppelganger that can just become anyone at any time and switch between being an elf and a human. It is an identity. When the Ghaunadan shifts into its humanoid form for the first time, that's what its humanoid form is. It can't swap its appearance or change things willy-nilly any more than you or I can. It just happens to also be an ooze some of the time. So this means that there are some limitations on what the Ghaunadan is able to do. I mean, you could always ignore that rule if you had a specific idea that you wanted to explore with a Ghaunadan NPC, but rules as written, that's typically how they work. Now, whether that identity is chosen by the Ghaunadan, or if it's something that they just naturally have happen to them, that really depends on you as the DM, because there's nothing really about that. There's nothing really about how they reproduce either. As oozes, I imagine they reproduce the same way most other oozes do, which is when they've absorbed a certain amount of matter, they just split off a part of themselves. And who knows, maybe they do have families and their children who used to be part of them change into the same type of creature that their humanoid form is, you know? Like a Ghaunadan who turns into a drow elf will beget other Ghaunadan's that turn into drow elves, something like that. Personally, I kind of like the idea that they get to craft their own identity. That maybe when a Ghaunadan changes into its humanoid form for the first time, it gets to choose every little bit about how it looks and how it identifies itself. And I think there's something kind of neat about that. The only other thing I'll really say about that is when it comes to damage that one of these creatures have taken, I do think it makes logical sense that they would be able to reform their humanoid version of themselves perfectly, which could be a tip-off to some of your players. Maybe they have an encounter with one of these guys and he refrains from using his pseudopod attack, and when he does get struck, they notice that he kind of bleeds this weird, like, caustic green blood, and they just might not really know what's going on with that. Maybe there's magic involved, maybe he's got some undead necromancy about him, who knows, it could be a million things in a fantasy world. But let's say they give him a really nasty scar across his face, and they're like, oh man, like, he got away this time, but we really messed him up. And then the next time they encounter that villain, that scar is completely gone. I think that makes sense, because as it reforms its body, eventually when its like ooze form has time to heal and reconstitute itself, that's what makes up the body that it transforms into. So it would make sense that scars and permanent wounds, like losing a hand or something like that, wouldn't be permanent for this creature. So that can be a fun way to kind of tip off your players that something is going on beyond what they're seeing. In any case, that is all I've really got to say about these guys today. I think the Ghaunadan are super cool. If you like this creature and you want to use it, like I said, there is a stat block in the description below in the form of a Google document. And if you are one of my lovely patrons, of course, you got the whole monster manual style stat block posted over on the Patreon page. If you're not a patron, check it out. It's a small little bonus, it makes the stat block a little bit easier to look at, but ultimately it does help me out a lot and help support the channel. And of course, as I have said many a time, the one thing you can do to support this channel more than anything is tell your friends. No other community shows up the way you guys do to these videos, and I appreciate that so much. To pull back the YouTube analytics curtain a little bit, with the amount of subscribers that this channel has versus the amount of views that every one of these Monster of the Week videos gets, it's unprecedented. Like, the ratio there, you guys always show up, and I appreciate that so much. And if you've got a monster you'd like to see featured on this channel from AD&D 3.5, 3.0, 4th edition, Pathfinder, whatever the case is, leave a comment and I'll definitely investigate it and add it to the ever-growing monster request list. Maybe you'll see it show up on the channel sometime. But thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Until then.